Hello, everybody, and welcome to my talk on data-driven documentation, or DDD, as I'll call it for the next 30 minutes, with the hope that my little initialism catches on with the Write the Docs crowd. My name is Luc Perkins, and I'm extremely happy to be giving my first main stage talk for Write the Docs, a community with which I've been involved since the very first conference in Portland, all the way back in 2013. I'm actually recording this talk in Portland, my home city, and actually I'm very sad not to be seeing you all this year, and of course wishing you all much strength and perseverance in these extremely tricky times. So the germ of the idea that I'm presenting here today actually goes back to a lightning talk that I did at Write the Docs in Prague this last fall. You know, back when traveling and in-person conferences were a thing. So the core ideas might already be a bit familiar to some of you who are watching. So a little bit about me first. I have worn many different hats in our industry. I've worked as a developer, software engineer. I've worked in DevRel or developer relations, and I've also spent a couple years just as a plain old tech writer. And as a tech writer, I've written docs for a number of large open source projects, and I've also worked on documentation tools and infrastructure. And I think that this kind of multifaceted experience has provided me with some hard-won insight into how to scale larger documentation projects and also how to keep them maintainable over time. And as you'll see, I believe strongly that DDD has an important role to play in that. Okay, switching over to presentation mode. As you know, I'm Luc Perkins. I should also say briefly at the outset that this is my first recorded talk, and getting this all to work has been a little bit rough. So apologize for any rough edges around that. At the outset, let me say a little something about the intended audience for this talk. So if you're currently using tools like Dita, or writing in an XML-based system, or Madcap Flare, something like that, then I think that you're kind of already operating within the DDD paradigm. So you may actually not get a ton out of this talk. I'm not really sure, or you might. Instead, the talk is more directed toward people who are working with markup languages like Markdown, RST, ASCII doc, things of that sort, and also using markup languages in conjunction with static site generators like Jekyll and Hugo, Gatsby, Sphinx, Docusaurus, and tools of that sort. And for reasons that I hope will become clear, the talk is also geared toward larger, more multifaceted, and more sort of complex documentation projects. That is, projects where scalability and maintainability are primary concerns. I think for a lot of smaller projects where those aren't primary concerns, I think you'll find that maybe DDD is not super important or useful. But in that case, I hope that this talk at least gives you some solid grounding in how to make that decision. So I want to start talking about DDD by drawing a fundamental distinction between two different approaches to docs. The first approach I want to talk about is called the narrative approach. Now, the narrative approach is one that all of us are intimately familiar with as documentarians, because the goal of the narrative approach is to provide descriptive, carefully worded prose with a human empathic touch. And this is something that we talk about every year at Write the Docs, and something that we all hopefully aspire to do every single day. To give just a few examples, you'd want to use a narrative approach to elucidate a tricky concept, or to sell a project or product or platform or tool using more florid, superlative language, or to walk a user through a complex task. Just to give a couple off-the-cuff examples among many. So essentially, if you need to illuminate, guide, or even inspire, then the narrative approach is your friend. Nowadays, we typically do narrative docs by writing markup files in our preferred language, like Markdown, RST, ASCII doc, etc. I call this the big folder of markup files approach to doing docs, which, as I'd like to show in this talk, has certain built-in limitations that are worth being aware of. So the other approach to docs is what I call the data-driven approach, or DDD. Now DDD involves generating documentation, usually HTML, although sometimes PDF or some other format like that, like maybe EPUB, out of some kind of structured data source that usually presents itself in two different core data types, and those are lists and key value maps. And over the course of the talk, I plan to illustrate these data types by way of example in several places. So where exactly is this structured data coming from in DDD? Well, most frequently you'll see it in the form of JSON, YAML, or other files, maybe CSV, TOML, a couple others, in the project's directory. But it's also common nowadays to find, for example, fetching JSON data from an external API like GitHub or Stack Exchange. So stepping back and reflecting on these approaches a bit, I think that the pros of the narrative approach are pretty clear. Good narrative text is lively and it's engaging and it has a human touch that has the power to really draw the reader in. But the narrative approach does have two core limitations from my perspective. The first of these limitations is maintainability. So narrative docs can be hard to update in large, complex projects, and the larger and more complex the project, the more tricky this becomes. So think about all the times that you've been working on docs, and the project experiences like a version bump or the installation prerequisites change. Now, when that happens, you have to dig through all the places in the text that mention that and do a manual update. Now, doing Control F to find all the places where something is mentioned is okay, but it's kind of brittle. It's easy to forget, and the next person who works on the docs may not even know that this is part of the documentation maintenance and updating process. From my perspective, it's always much better to have some well understood lever in place for updating that information, because it makes inconsistencies and slippages a lot less likely over time. And as you can imagine, I think that DDD tends to be a much better lever than the Control F method. Another major drawback is that we documentarians nowadays, and I think potentially even more so over time, are called upon to present information that's best described as reference material, like long lists of configurable parameters or operating system compatibility matrices, things of that sort. And keeping this information inside of a standard markup file can really be quite cumbersome, as I and presumably many of you have found out the hard way. So now that I've shown some of the limitations of the narrative approach, let's jump into DDD in a very concrete way. What on earth does this DDD thing look like in practice? I'll start with a few examples that are simple, but I think fairly illustrative. And by the way, I've actually listed these examples with some accompanying information and links in the repo there that you see in the slide. So github.com/Luc Perkins /data-driven documentation. Let's start with download pages. So nowadays, software is often targeted to many different platforms. So different operating systems, different devices, different cloud environments. So when you come to a typical downloads page, what you often see is a wealth of options. You'll see different versions of the software available. You'll see different operating systems, like I said, Raspberry Pi, Linux distributions. You'll see instructions for pulling Docker containers. You'll see links to downloading and fetching tarballs and just all kinds of different stuff. And one download page that I worked on myself was for a project called Spire. So I'll just sort of scroll through and show you the page a little bit here. Now, what you see here is that download pages are a great candidate for DDD because there's a lot of information to present and manage, usually including a lot of long, unwieldy URLs. You definitely don't want to hard code those into markup files. You want to generate those using some kind of template. Now, in the case of Spire, there are hundreds of generated URLs on this page. So basically each of these little clickable things. So you have click to copy link to the clipboard, click to trigger download. You're looking at probably, I'm going to say, 250 different URLs that are currently active on that page. Now, you could keep all this information in a big markup file, but then, what happens if, say, the structure of the URL changes, or, some part of each URL is different? That sounds like it's going to be time for a lot of really, really unfun copying and pasting. So download pages are a great candidate, I believe. Going back, another good example is command line tool docs. So command line tools nowadays are an integral part of many software platforms, whether it's databases or operating systems and so on and so forth. But CLI tools tend to be tricky to document using a narrative approach because there's just a lot of information to present. You have commands, many of which have their own subcommands and sub-sub-sub-commands, and those commands in turn often have flags associated with them and default values and example usages, and that's something that can also get really, really messy really quickly. So I will show you some CLI docs that I generated using DDD for a project called Jaeger. Now, Jaeger has a handful of different CLI tools that are associated with it. So you see there's a Jaeger agent, there's a Jaeger collector, a Jaeger ingester, a Jaeger query, so on and so forth. Now, each one of these different CLI tools has a wide variety of command flags that you can use with it. And these flags have default values, and each of them needs to have a pithy description that says what it does. So we scroll down here and you see that there are just hundreds of these things. And initially when we were working on this project, we basically did everything in a kind of narrative approach fashion, and just kind of had like big long tables of these flags and these commands in markup files. And ultimately we ended up opting for a DDD approach, which I think has been much better. And what we essentially are doing in this project is that, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit, but basically each of these different CLI tools is built to produce a JSON representation of what the CLI tool is doing, or rather of what the interfaces provided by the CLI tool are. And so we use that to generate JSON out of this, and then we use Hugo, the static site generator used on the site, to actually turn this into the reasonably pretty HTML output that you see on this page. A third example of DDD is one that I think most of us are probably most familiar with, which is REST API docs. So, this is a form API docs in general, I think are probably the form of DDD that a lot of us are most familiar with throughout the entire software world. So if you've ever read, Java docs for Java, or PyDocs for Python, or Hex docs for Elixir, or if you've looked at REST API docs generated from an OpenAPI specification, then you too have basked in the glory that is DDD. To pull up an example, I think one example of REST API docs that are considered a standard bearer in our industry are the API docs for Stripe. And I just navigated to the page here, and you can see that they're just absolutely beautiful, and they're also extremely comprehensive. It's astonishing just how much information is contained just on this one page. Now, there's just no way that the narrative approach to documentation could have produced something like this. This is, when you see something like this, this is something that really, really illustrates the full breadth and power of DDD in a very, very succinct way. Now, to be clear, there's also plenty of the narrative approach at work here, because you'll find descriptions and explanations of things that are in plain English and that are for the most part very, very well written. But in general, the overall structuring principle of documentation like this is purely data-driven. So I don't have access to the Stripe's infrastructure for building this, of course, but what they're doing here is that they are taking an enormous YAML file that defines the open API spec that they use across their many different services, and using that in conjunction with a static site generator and some very, very, very top-notch CSS design people to build this beautiful, wondrous artifact that you see in front of you here. So now we've seen some DDD end products, and that's reasonably cool. But right now you're probably saying, hey, how can I bring some of that DDD magic into my own life? Well, here I'm going to walk you through an extremely basic example of how you might build a downloads table using DDD. So this example here would work directly with the static site generator Hugo, but you could accomplish something similar in Jekyll or Middleman or in any number of tools or platforms. So let's start with the data. Now here you see a YAML file called versions.yaml that's in the data directory, which in Hugo is where you keep your data files that you want to use in your templates. And that file lists 4 versions of some piece of software that we're just going to call my project. Now that data can then be used in a template that I'm calling versions table, or just version table, my bad. Here you can see in the template that I'm storing the contents of that data file inside of this versions variable. And then from there, I'm using that data to build an HTML table. So you see here, we have the table, we have the head of the table with the column names. And then here in the body of the table, we're iterating through each version in this list, and we're taking the index of where it is in the list, starting with 0, as lists go in most programming languages, and also the version information. So with each one of these version bits of information, we're going to create a row in the table. So first, in the left-hand cell or the left-hand column, we're going to display just the version information right here. So 0.10.1 and then 0.10.0 in the next row. And another thing that we're doing is if it's the first version in the table, that is, if the index is equal to 0, then we're going to put latest in parentheses there, just so people know that this is the most that this is the latest, greatest version of my project. And then in the next column, we are going to generate a download link. So here you can see that we're constructing a specific URL out of the version information for a specific tarball, and as the actual content or as the tag on the anchor, we're just going to do my project dash version. So the end result would look like this. So here you see that here we have the version column, the download link column, the different version information displayed, and each of these would hypothetically in really generated HTML would be a clickable link that would initiate a download of that particular tarball. So this is definitely a very simple example, but you can see that if you were dealing with dozens of different versions of a platform, and if you needed to provide download links for, say, 5 different Linux distributions for each one of these versions, then DDD would be essentially an indispensable way to do this. You would not want to do this using a standard narrative approach. And you can also see how some of the other examples I mentioned in the last slide can be done this way. So with CLI docs, for example, you could also maybe create a table, iterate through each command that's available in that particular tool, and produce formatted HTML for each command that's available. And the sky is really the limit here. So now I would like to illuminate some basic DDD workflows. These have kind of been implicit in my talk thus far, but I think it's worth making them more explicit and bundling them into a neat little list. So the first one is the file system approach that I mentioned before. So let's say you have some JSON or some YAML in your project directory tree that you update with new information. That means you add a version to the list, you add a CLI command to the CLI docs, you add a REST API endpoint to the Open API docs, you commit the change, and then boom, your new docs build is now up to date. The second approach involves fetching the structured data from somewhere else. So this might mean using curl to fetch JSON from an API like the GitHub API, which provides a wealth of information like release information. And some static site generators like Hugo even have built-in capabilities for fetching external data and using it for your templates. So you saw the generated downloads page for the Spire project that I showed you before. I'll just go back to that really quick here. So this project actually fetches all of the release information from the GitHub API. So when the site is built, it reaches out to GitHub and says, hey, I need some JSON about every version of Spire that's available. The JSON comes in a local file system, or rather probably into memory or something. And then I actually use that data directly to build this HTML template. So you don't even need to have a human in the loop there that updates the version information. It's just GitHub has the most up-to-date thing. So every time you build the site, you're getting the appropriate information. Now, another one, a third approach, let me get back to presentation mode. There we go. A third approach worth mentioning is actually generating your data sources using some other process and incorporating that into your documentation publishing pipeline. So one example of this that I talked about before is the Jaeger CLI doc. So some CLI tools produce JSON or YAML output describing the tool. So let's say you have a list of commands, each of which is a key value map describing the different flags that are available. It may describe default values for the flags, its example usages of the command, and then you can even have nested subcommands inside of that. So it's a lot of information. And I would say, it's something that some CLI tools provide. Personally, I think it's a best practice, and I think that all CLI tools should provide this because then it makes them all fodder for DDD and for generated documentation. So with this approach, when you build your docs, your pipeline could essentially install the desired version of the CLI tool, generate a data representation of the tool's interface, and then you can use your static site generator to use that data and in conjunction with the template and generate nice, pretty, clean HTML out of that. And this is exactly what we did with the Jaeger docs that I showed you before. So basically, every time the site is built, the CLI tool is installed, JSON is generated for that particular version of the CLI, and then Hugo uses that JSON to make generated styled HTML. So if you think that DDD sounds interesting and cool and everything, and you want to explore this domain a little bit more, I'll recommend some things that you might want to check out. So first, our static site generators, which we've talked about a little bit before. Virtually all of the major static site generators nowadays enable you to generate HTML out of structured data. Personally, I'm an enthusiastic Hugo user, but Jekyll and Middleman and Sphinx and lots of other tools do offer this. I definitely recommend digging into these capabilities and seeing if perhaps you can bring DDD into one of your own projects. There is admittedly a bit of a learning curve here with static site generators. They all have kind of finicky templating languages and that are not always easy to wrap your brain around. But I think that once you become familiar with recursing through a data structure using whichever templating language is on offer in the generator, you may find yourself doing some very acrobatic and very exciting things in very little time. Another branch of DDD that I think is very much worth checking out is the so-called headless CMS movement, and there are tons of these. Contentful and Sanity and Happy. There's dozens and dozens of them that have come along in recent years. So headless CMSs are different from traditional CMSs like WordPress and Drupal because they don't actually have a view layer attached. So you're basically dealing with raw document data. So instead of being a combined data plus HTML generation platform, what they do is they're basically data APIs that you can use to push and pull content. So basically, instead of your content living in your local file system inside of your docs directory, it can be pulled down from an external API at build time and then used to generate HTML using the templates that you create. And for me, the cool thing about these systems is that they typically offer very good WYSIWYG editors, and the content can be potentially used by many different sites. So one of the limitations of the traditional static site generator approach is that all of your file content lives in one file system, and you're pretty much only using that to build one site. Well, with a headless CMS, you're basically taking the principle that I talked about, like fetching JSON from the GitHub API and using that to generate docs. It's basically a generalization of that same principle that could apply to all of your documentation content. So basically, anything that can access that API can pull down the information that you need to build, and that could be your documents, it could be your version lists, it could be your operating system compatibility matrices. Whatever that data needs to be, it can all be in a centralized place and potentially usable by lots and lots and lots of different clients. And finally, some closing reflections on DDD. First, I would say always bear in mind that the narrative approach and DDD are complementary approaches. Ideally, a large multifaceted docs project would have elements of both approaches contained in it. Where, for example, DDD provides lists of configurable parameters and CLI tool docs and download matrices and REST API docs, while the narrative approach provides beautiful elucidations of difficult concepts and tricky how-tos. A second point I'd like to make is definitely don't overdo it with DDD. DDD is a really, really great approach, but it usually involves both a cognitive tax and an upfront engineering cost that I think are very much worth it in some cases, but also very much not worth it in others. If you're writing docs for a database that has only, let's say, a handful of tunable parameters, maybe just keep it simple and have a plain old markdown list. Consistent with a more narrative approach. But if your database has 100 parameters and counting, and they're divided into 12 categories, and they're changing all the time, then it's probably very much worthwhile to put everything in a big YAML file that your engineering team is comfortable updating. And finally, last but not least, branch out. And by that I mean not just give DDD a try and explore the space a little bit more, but I would say also be prepared to potentially become a different type of information wrangler in our industry. I feel like software is becoming a lot more complex. It's becoming a lot more multifaceted. Platforms are becoming bigger and badder. And the number of knobs and levers in the proverbial cockpit really feels like it's slowly increasing over time. And this is across different domains of our industry. I do think that DDD has a really important role to play in taming a lot of this informational complexity, and I would urge many of you to acquire at least some fluency in DDD concepts and tools and approaches. Definitely don't leave behind the narrative approach, because good prose is always going to be essential to our art as documentarians. But I do think that we potentially become more valuable as tech writers when we can seamlessly blend approaches in projects that need it. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. I miss all of you very much, and I truly hope to see you all at a future Write the Docs in person one of these days when things become a little bit less tricky. I would very much love to continue the discussion in any number of venues. So feel free to tweet at me at Luc Perkins on Twitter. Also, feel free to file issues and pull requests on the little repo that I put together on GitHub. And until next time, stay healthy and safe, everyone.
Thank you for your talk. I thought it was really cool in the beginning that you actually started the presentation without slides, and you also set out, I guess, a description of the audience that you're addressing, because it is pretty technical. And at the same time, too, I thought it was a pretty good introduction to at least some of the terminology related to Docs' code stuff for people who might be a little bit less familiar. So thank you. I'm going to go ahead and get into some of the questions because we have a time. And one of the first questions from our stage chat was from Kirsten. Kirsten was asking if you have any experience or recommendations for creating docs that use both static site generators for DDD and that would integrate that content with a CMS or HAT. I don't know what an HAT is.
Yeah, I'm also not sure. Yeah, that's a good question. It really depends on if you're using like a traditional CMS system, like a WordPress or a Drupal type thing, or if you're using like a recent so-called headless CMS system where just storing data up here and then fetching it at build time and then running it through a generator to produce your actual output. That's a good question. I wouldn't be surprised when it comes to traditional CMSs. I don't know this for certain, but I wouldn't be surprised if like WordPress and some of the others had special plugins and things that enabled you to adopt some kind of approach like this. But that's not something I can really speak to directly, unfortunately.
Can you talk a little bit more about what a headless CMS is? Because I know you talk about it a little bit in the slides, but I always blank when I hear that term.
So a traditional CMS like WordPress, WordPress, Drupal, and there's a bunch of them. The model there is basically you get a WYSIWYG editor and you drop in and you create content, and you write and you publish, and that content goes into a database, and then when it comes time to actually present that content as HTML, it gets run through your stored template and your various plugins and things of that sort. And what makes such a CMS traditional is that these things are all tightly coupled to one another. So when you go to your WordPress site or your WordPress instance, you're getting all of this at once. And when you're authoring content, you're authoring it for a specific template and for a specific site. What's different about a headless CMS is that you take away the template layer. So what you're doing is what a headless CMS is essentially like the database part of a traditional CMS like WordPress. So you're storing all this content maybe as JSON or something behind some kind of API, and it could be sophisticated. You might have like 25 to 100 different content types, and you can create new content types, and it's just like a fancy API. And then what you can do with the headless CMS is that you have your data over here, and then you can have any number of clients actually consuming that data. So you might have like five different websites within your company that are all using some subset of the information that's being stored behind the API. So I think that kind of strict separation between the data layer and the templating and the view layer is what characterizes so-called headless CMSs.
Sort of like the concept behind the original title for your talk, the model, the view, or the controller. I guess we're not really talking about that.
Yeah, exactly. So your data models and your data structures and the content itself is all going to live over here, API, and then and what that essentially enables is that when it comes to workflows and organizational distribution of labor and things like that, that your design folks can sort of operate into your content folks and your design folks can operate more independently of one another than they perhaps were able to do previously. And I think that the potential scalability, I guess organizational scalability benefits of that are pretty clear.
Interesting. I think at this point I want to mention that Jessica Parsons, either last year or the year before, she gave a talk on doc-driven development, which I'm going to keep confusing with what you're referring to as data-driven documentation, but maybe more relevant to what we've just been talking about. She's got a podcast conversation with our Write the Docs podcast hosts about this stuff, about static site generators, and they talk about headless CMSs, and it's all very cool. Yeah, I'm gonna get.
I'm going to make a note and look that up for sure.
Yay! Might post a link later if I get a chance.
Okay.
I'm going to get back to some of the questions that we have from the stage chat. Tom Johnson had asked, if I create a custom script to pull content from structured reference information like YAML, how can I validate the reference structure?
That's kind of up to you. I think that some, like in terms of validation, some static site generators do enable you to like throw error messages and things like that. So you're pulling in data and it turns malformed, like it's lacking a field that you're expecting, or there's like a null value that you weren't that shouldn't be there. You can actually throw error messages directly. I know Hugo does this. I'm sure that Jekyll probably can as well, and some of the others. That's one way to do it. And if you throw an error, then that may mean that you either need to talk to the people producing that data and tell them that it's malformed, or you might even potentially have some kind of separate script or process that can validate it, or what's the word I'm looking for? Not purify, but that can I don't know, wrangle it into the proper structure that you're expecting on the static site generator side. So that that's one of those like up to you kind of things, I would say. But there are lots of different possibilities, and I've seen all kinds of very intricate CI pipelines that pull in data from one place, store it in a JSON file on disk, and then a Python script like looks at it and says like something is awry here, or we need to rewrite this into something that we understand. And then the static site generator takes that kind of finished product, or maybe the static site generator just consumes that data directly and responds using its own templating system in its own right.
Okay. Looking at some more of the questions that we've got, a lot of people are asking and wondering about blending these concepts of narrative documentation with what you're describing as data-driven documentation. I thought it was really great that you gave us sort of like a look at how Stripe actually builds their documentation, because we keep hearing about how their documentation is so great, but I guess it's also really helpful just to see how they actually did it. I'm looking at a question from Owen from a while back, and he says that DDD seems great when you want exhaustive coverage of a thing, but I wonder how to best blend this with narrative. Like if there's a sea of CLI flags that I would hate for the user to have to scroll. What are you thinking?
Yeah, so I think that's a problem where DDD is. I guess that's an area where DDD is the problem and the solution, because you can also use DDD to generate a super handy, like let's say navigation thing on the page that is going to bring you to exactly the right thing, or even maybe you could even like use it to build a search widget or something. So you have your one big page with all your different CLI tools and commands, subcommands, flags, default values, and so on and so forth. And so one way to present that information would be, okay, folks, there it is. But you also might have a handy little widget, a generated widget up in the corner that can guide you to the specific things that you need in a much more granular way. And I think that in general is what I would recommend.
Cool. I think I will mention at this point that we have about 5 minutes to the beginning of our next presentation, but we'll just keep rolling with the Q&A. I think we've just got a lot of questions. I know Julia had posted several questions in the stage chat about what we've just been talking about, balancing DDD with narrative approaches and things like that. She's also posted another question in the chat here. She's asking if you could share information about ways to host published content. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's that's an area where there's lots and lots of different ways. You can push generated static assets into like S3 or Google Object Storage or something like that. I know that a lot of the cloud platforms have static hosting systems like that even enable you to to configure a certain bucket as a website, browsable as a website. That's certainly one way. So you could, you can store everything in S3 behind a certain bucket, and then you can use DNS to map, myproject.io to that specific S3 bucket, something like that. There are platforms that are more that I think are more purpose built for this. So Netlify is one that people talk about a lot. GitHub Pages actually does this. I'm not a huge GitHub Pages fan myself, but it is definitely purpose built for this kind of thing. Firebase hosting is another one, and platforms is that they take away. So I just said you can throw everything up in S3 and handle DNS and all that good stuff. There are platforms that kind of offer this as a one, as a bundled set of features where you basically say hey, I'm declaring the existence of a site. It's in this GitHub repo. Now do your work, and when you do your work, it's going to be behind this DNS address that I've already chosen, and it's going to build a deploy preview every time I update the source and things like that. So that's another way to do it.
We probably have 1 minute. I'm going to squeeze in one more question. We've got a lot of questions that we don't have time for, but I think you all can decide if you'd like to stay in the chat, if Luke would like to stay in the chat and keep typing at each other. We got a question from Brian a little while back relating to Hugo, and he had asked if you've used the sawmill blocks approach, and maybe for those of us who don't know what that is, if you could explain that a little bit. If you've used that, and do you see information in the front matter as a source for DDD? I personally, I'm not sure what the sawmill blocks. That's not a term I'm familiar with, unfortunately. But yeah, I do think that when it comes to the page front matter, that's certainly something you can do. So you can use tags, you can use just arbitrary key value metadata that you put on each page, and you can either, with a lot of static site generators, you can use it to either present that info somewhere on the page, or to present or to gather, collected metadata about all your pages. So you can even with Hugo and Jekyll and things like this, you can even say hey, what are the pages on which this is true, on which this bit of front matter exists, or on which this tag is present. And you can do that. I mean, you can generate a sitemap out of that. You can generate search JSON, things like that. It really is kind of okay. Apparently it's a forestry IO thing. So sawmill. Oh, okay. Yeah. I haven't used forestry in a while, so at the moment I can't really speak to that, unfortunately. But that's something I should look into. Very cool. We're out of time, but let's keep chatting if people like it, specifically in the session chat. Just wanted to say thanks again, Luke, for joining us for the Q&A and for your talk. And
I will stick around in the chat.
Cool. I'm going to pop off, but I'll probably post a link there too. Thanks again.
Okay.